when we look at the history of labor, this is where it gets really, really interesting. This was the Harold Wilson era, the administration of Harold Wilson. Now, most people will not remember this guy in the administration, so let me just break it down real fast for you. So this was a labor government. This was decades ago, and this labor government of Harold Wilson was so terrible, and key personnel, including Wilson himself, was under suspicion of being Soviet agents or Soviet moles, right? The situation became so ludicrous, even the CIA became involved. This is when James Angleton himself, from CIA counterintelligence, went to the MI5 in Britain and said, look, guys, you have a problem. Wilson is a suspect. Other people are suspect. And actually, we have a defector from the USSR. He wouldn't say, I think he didn't even tell them who it was. It was Anatoly Golitsyn. I'm not sure if he actually divulged the identity. He didn't do that with the French. So we have an actual defector saying Wilson is highly suspect, this labor guy running the government.
Let me give you the story on that. Anatoly Golitsyn, when he defected, said that he had knowledge about a plot to assassinate a major party leader in a Western country and replace that party leader with someone who was an agent of the Soviet Union. And he said that it was going to happen in 1962 or 3. He defected in late 61, and it was, I think it was it early 63 that Hugh Gaitskell, or was it 62? Hugh Gaitskell, the head of the Labour Party, went to the Soviet embassy and had tea and crumpets, and then shortly thereafter he died suddenly.
Magic.
And they did an autopsy, and they brought it to Peter Wright at MI5, and the autopsy showed that he died of lupus. He had lupus so bad that his own basically after being at the Soviet embassy, his own immune system turned around, attacked his internal organs, and killed him. I think it caused kidney or heart failure or something. So that was like, oh my gosh. But then Angleton, as you said, came over, and Angleton said, look, an assassination was planned against a party leader. They were going to die soon, and the guy who was going to replace him was their guy. Well, Harold Wilson had all these ties to East European communist businessmen.
Timber.
Businessmen.
Timber.
And so he was, and so Angleton thought, this is what Golitsyn's talking about. And of course, if you read Spycatcher by Peter Wright's thinking, this looks bad. This looks like the leader, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, may have been a Soviet agent.
Yeah. In terms of espionage, I mean, you're talking about a situation that is pretty much like a nuclear meltdown at a power plant, right? I mean, if you have a partner of the United States, such as Great Britain, and now the suspicion is the Prime Minister is dirty. Prime Minister could be a mole. The head of MI5 could be a
Sir
Soviet
Roger
agent.
Hollis. Later, Sir Roger Hollis came to be suspected by Peter Wright, and that's why the book Spycatcher is banned in Britain. You can't find that book in Britain.
And people started to wonder, why was this guy Hollis even allowed to join MI5, let alone go up the ranks and become the head of the service, because he was not qualified for the job, right? So so then you have this crazy situation. Prime Minister is a suspect. The close friend of the Prime Minister, Joseph Kagan, was also a suspect. MI5 director is a suspect. And there were other suspects. So this is about as bad as it gets. And so this Prime Minister Wilson, Labour guy, he had his private secretary, a woman called Marcia Williams, who was also an aristocrat. She was the Baroness Falkender. And these two had multiple visits to the USSR. They call it business trips, obviously, as you mentioned. And Wilson's press guy said that, these two, Wilson and his secretary, they actually met Nikita Khrushchev for dinner believe it or not. And so then the CIA was looking into the guy. The MI5 was looking into the guy, which is of course crazy because, you know, the MI5 is part of the government and they have to investigate the prime minister. So then they started to dig into Wilson and his past. So Wilson was trading timber from the communists. And so there were 19 trips to the Soviet Union. Wilson also liked to use the MI5 when he needed the MI5 to discredit his political opponents. There was a strike in 1966, and he tried to use the MI5 against that. And so this became such a problem in Britain that a group of powerful conservatives got together in private and they discussed getting rid of Wilson. Okay, so as much as we know about these secret meetings and the people involved, it sounds kind of like a soft coup, which would have been legit, judging from the situation they were in. I mean, if your country is threatened by communist assets, you have to spring into action. That's just how it goes. And so this was a bunch of people. You had David Sterling involved in that conservative group. He was the founder of the SAS. This was special forces. Some aristocrats in it, former military guys in it, and Cecil King was in it. And so then they tried to get Louis Mountbatten on board. Lord Louis Mountbatten.
Oops.
From the royal family. Actually, the Mountbatten name is bogus. He's from the noble house of Hessen, which is about 1,000 years old. So they thought he's the right guy for this. And they talked to him and said, we need you for this, but you're supposed to stay out of this in public until the thing happens. So we might get the armed forces involved, and we need a royal person to say that this is a good thing, this is a necessary thing to give it legitimacy, because everybody in the government or everybody who works for the government in Britain is sworn to the king, is sworn to the empire and nobility. So they thought Mountbatten was their guy, but Mountbatten didn't really react to it. He told them, nah, I'm too old, I don't like this doesn't sound right, I don't want to be involved, I'm too old, you know, just yeah, whatever. So he turned them down. And the next thing, what happened was the plot was leaked to the press, or parts of it were leaked to the press. So now you get these journalists involved. Of course, you get these labor people involved, and they're framing this in the obvious way. They're saying, look at these evil right-wingers, these evil conservatives, these reactionary people. They want to smear the good Wilson. They're making things up. They're using the intelligence service to make Wilson look bad. And this narrative persists to this very day, right? So now that begs the question, who leaked this stuff to the press? And why didn't Mountbatten get involved? And why did other powerful aristocrats, why did they not get involved? Why didn't they get rid of Wilson? Now, by now, we know a whole lot more how this all worked. Here's a story from Esquire. This is called "A KGB Spy Worked in Buckingham Palace for Decades." So this was a couple of years ago, I think, the story, because there was a television show on. It's called The Crown, and they touch upon some of these subjects. And so Esquire gives a bit more of the background. And this is about Sir Anthony Blunt. He was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, really close to the royal family. He was a spy for the Soviet Union for a very long time. And during his espionage, he acquired some significant secrets about the royal family. This concerned Prince Philip, they say, and we know a whole lot more about that. And it also concerns something else. It says here in Esquire, they say it's more likely that the Mountbatten-Windsor clan kept their lips tight to protect their own honor. As we know, Anthony Blunt had insider knowledge of the Duke of Windsor's correspondence with the Nazis, which the Queen was determined to keep secret from the world. Ah, there we go. So, what happened was what happened was Louis Mountbatten had a specific job after World War II. He was supposed to gather these secret documents from castles in Germany, because all over Germany were these aristocrats from the House of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein and Sachsen-Coburg-Gotha and all these families. So he was supposed to gather these documents and bring them home to Britain to be stashed away for further use. And he sent Anthony Blunt to get these documents, and by now you have documentaries like on, I think it was Channel 4, and they say that Mr. Blunt photographed all these documents potentially, and he microdotted it, he microfilmed it, put it on this little dot, it's called a microdot, and smuggled it to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union knew all kinds of dirty stuff from the royals, some pretty serious stuff. So, various books came out over the years talking about this whole big espionage problem linked to Blunt. So, it's not a stretch to think that the royal family, which is far bigger than people realize, it's actually a cluster of families, it's not a stretch to think that they would make some sort of a secret deal with the Soviets and say, you shut up about our secrets, and we do things for you. And this may have included letting moles infiltrate Britain further, right? So, was it maybe Mountbatten who leaked the stuff to the press so Wilson could stay in power? What did Mountbatten? Did Mountbatten actually protect Wilson and covered things up for Wilson so Wilson could stay in place? This is a very legitimate question, and this tells us a ton about socialism in Britain, right? When these high-powered people get compromised by the communists, this not only affects all of Britain's security, it affected Europe's security, Western Europe. It affected the United States because the Queen, for a long time, Queen Elizabeth, she knew all kinds of stuff about American secrets. I remember this anecdote from this book. What was it called? The Secret Royals or something, fairly recent, from some very accredited historians. And they said, well, there was this American guy visiting the Queen once, and this American guy had a very, very secret role that nobody was supposed to know, and the Queen knew about it. She basically let the guy know, the American know, that she knew all about him. This became America's problem. And yeah, and also the rest of it, the atomic spies that MI5 couldn't catch before they were shipped over to America for the Manhattan Project. And people actually, there was new books about the atomic spies, and they tried to piece together how many times MI5 must have, quote unquote, failed to catch these spies. This completely unlikely string of failures that made it possible for the American nuclear program to be infiltrated. Now, obviously, even at the time, people thought there must have been some high-ranking mole, and there's several suspects who may have been these moles. Now, of course, if you have a person like Mountbatten, he could install other moles, or he could protect other moles for the Soviets. And this is socialism in Britain for you. This is the Labour Party. This may have started as a plot of some Privy Council guys and lords saying, we create our own socialism and we run it, haha, and this all went bad. This all went sideways. This whole thing with the Fabian Society, I mean, if you look at the literature of the Fabian Society, which basically then created the Labour Party, the Fabians were initially meant to give a new image to the British Empire. To have sort of a British-controlled socialism and, just rearrange the empire, make it all work, sort of, and this is kind of how it started, but this is not how it ended. Really not how it ended.
Well, the Fabian Society was the same thing as the League for Industrial Democracy, I think it was called in New York. There was always these socialists. They weren't communists per se, although they were at times very friendly to the Soviet Union, to the point of being pro-Soviet. And of course, you have the Webbs, and you have H.G. Wells, and of course
The
George
webs.
Bernard Shaw.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, the Webbs, George Bernard Shaw. You've got these people who are, the prominent Fabians in Britain, and of course their symbol, the little sigil they use, is the wolf in sheep's clothing, the
Right.
Fabians. But you have the same thing in the United States, and of course with the father of American education at Columbia there. What's his name? He was a socialist. He became disillusioned with the Soviet Union later on. But it was socialism was apart from Sovietism was always a movement. There was even a socialist party or various socialist parties in the U.S. Like in Minnesota, it ended up being absorbed by the Democratic Party. I think Wisconsin had one at one time. There was a lot of socialists in California back 100+ years ago. So you had but they were never a majority. They were never able to dominate national politics in the United States. They're always a minority, and I think in Britain they maybe had more influence because you did have the Labour Party. They used to be in Britain the Liberal Party and the Tory Party. And then Labor came up, and Labor was much more socialist, right? I mean, Proletarians of the World United. It wasn't a communist party, it was a left party. And so Labor was growing until Labor sort of displaced the Liberal Party. I don't think the Liberal Party has had a government since since Lloyd George, I think. I try to think back.
Yeah.
I forget if there was a brief Labor government in the 20s. I don't think so, because from the point of Ramsay MacDonald's really very poor performance as a Labor government in the 1920s, they had solid Tory governments right up to World War II. And then they did something in World War II, which was maybe a mistake, but you can see why they did it. They formed a kind of coalition cabinet where they let all the parties come in and share together under Churchill. And then of course you have Labor comes to power, after the war, after Germany's defeated, but before Japan is defeated. Churchill is beaten, and Labor really grew strong during the war, because wars are always sort of make government bigger and
Yeah.
make the promises of government bigger. And of course, because they had a socialist government come into power after the war, Britain had food rationing like they did during the war clear into the 1950s.
And fuel and stuff.
Everything. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it was horrible. And of course, it was, thank goodness for Margaret Thatcher, kind of pulled them out of some
Oh,
of
and wasn't
that.
it
But
wasn't
they
it the
never,
case? Wasn't it the case that when people looked at the economic recovery of Germany after World War II, and they saw like the economic miracle, and Britain was really struggling, so that helped the left.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. No. And of course, there was a German, some of these Austrian economists, and I forget the name, he wrote this wonderful book. He was the main advisor to the German governments after the war. And he said, you have to have, with Germany's position, you have to have free trade. And, he pushed that, and you have to have a vibrant free economy in Germany to recover. And he
Yeah.
was dead right. And they let him do it. They let that
Was
happen. And so
I
the
think it
German
was
economic,
Ludwig Erhard, maybe? Was it
no,
Ludwig
I've
Erhard
got
or
his
the other
book
guy?
right here, and I'm spacing on his name, and I can't find. I was just looking for the book, but he had a very interesting ideas. He wrote a book about morality in politics and economics, and which he said that he thought that big was bad. Big corporations are closer to socialism, and they can, you got oligopoly was a concept of Joseph Schumpeter. And he said, look, you should make everything on there are some industries that will have to be big, but everything that doesn't have to be an economy of scale, you allow to be small businesses. And he wanted a law where businesses could be no more than, I think, 255
Hmm.
employees. There's a special number. I forget what it's called, but there's a number which is the number of people that you can know and work with personally and know everybody.
Yeah.
That is kind of standard. And so that if you're a smart manager, you can, owner of a company, you can have that many people, and it's sort of like a kind of family where it's not as close as a family, but there's a closeness.
Right.
And I saw that philosophy in America working in things like hospitals and the older hospital management, because I saw a little bit of that in the 90s, where you have a guy who he started out as like a cook in the hospital kitchen, and he ends up becoming the director of the entire hospital. And he's like brilliant. He did a whole bunch of the jobs. He knew all the departments in the hospital. He kind of floated around to the different as he went
knew
up.
everybody's job, yeah.
He knew everybody, and he was nice. He was kind. He loved everybody. He understood all the problems, and he was like, that hospital was just. When I first came there, which was just around the time that he retired, I couldn't believe the food was good. Right? They had good food. The morale of the nurses was high. Then they bring in these managers with MBAs to work there. And what happens is that the morale goes like this. They start killing patients. The food becomes awful. Everything is, not so good. And I think that there is this idea that and also ownership. If you can't create a family feeling, ownership creates the boss is like a father to his employees. And when you have this, it's the best possible business. And this is the way I think human beings are made this way, to function this way, because it's like, oh, I'm working for him. I like him. He's a good guy. And then they will work extra hard because they want to please the guy, and they admire him, and he wants to take care of them. And this creates a good environment,
So one of the early organizations before the Fabian Society was called Fellowship of the New Life. And so they were pitching, baseline concepts that, like peace, vegetarianism, and living a simple life. Now that sounds pretty much like the World Economic Forum these days. You won't own anything. You'll be happy. We will take care of everything. You're going to rent everything. You will not own.
I'm going to be homeless, and I'm going to live under a bush.
Yeah, and also it's like oh, well, if you got nothing going on in your life, if you're broke and you have nothing and you have no real aspirations and you're never going to get anywhere, this is a noble thing, they'll say, because you're saving the environment. So there's a positive twist on being miserable, right? So this is not a new idea, obviously. The Fellowship of the New Life tried to establish this thing. And of course, people have to remember, this is not a Jewish invention. This is not some invention by the mythological, elders of Zion Lodge. These were these guys that came up with this stuff. And so you had people such as the Webbs. Sidney Webb was Baron Passfield, member of the Privy Council. He was a government secretary for British colonies and the Dominion stuff that they had going on. Worked in Ramsay MacDonald's second Labour government in 1929. And there was the other Webb, who was they had a Baron.
Beatrice.
Yeah, exactly. So you had the Webbs, and the Webbs were big fans of Stalin in the Soviet Union, believe it or not.
Yeah, they did. If you read Maysky's diaries, that was the Soviet ambassador. They were close to him,
Yeah. And so every time, so some people, they fell for this early leftist nonsense in Britain. Some people just believed it, but then of course you had other people that were more conservative, and they didn't fall for that. But there was another trap for those people, which was traditional conspiracy mythology. So if these other people, they didn't buy into socialism, you could give them conspiracy mythology and tell them, oh, well, if anything bad happens, it's the Jews, right? It's just so we're clear, it's these Jewish people.
It's the Jews.
And as long as you work with us, these fancy weirdo aristocrats, and you don't look at what we're actually doing behind your back with the Soviets, if you trust us, we can keep the Jews in check. That's basically how they pitched it back then. So these were the people praising Joseph Stalin. And they also had another organization called the Coefficients Club. And these were hardcore colonial administrators like Leo Amory, who's also in intelligence, Edward Grey, first Viscount Grey of Faladon, Privy Council and everything, Deputy Lieutenant of the Crown, Alfred Milner, the first Viscount Milner, also Privy Council, managing the empire. So this is also the big difference at the time between the United States of America and the still existing traditional British Empire, right? So because some people, especially today's left, they don't actually understand how different it was. They just call everything imperialism, which they don't like. But this was very, very different, even especially in those days. And so this is how these influential Brits tried to create their own socialism, but they lost more and more control of it, like we saw with Mountbatten. And suddenly this whole family cluster is compromised. So they're making some sort of a deal. And this is also why Anthony Blunt didn't go to prison for the rest of his life or was hung or something like that. But he got a sweet deal. They told everybody they turned him. They turned the traitor Blunt. And that's why he didn't go to the worst prison imaginable. This is kind of the excuse that they had.
Well, I should say that James Webb and was a lower middle class family. Sidney Webb was Sidney and Beatrice Webb were she was from a businessman family. She had an independent income. I guess a family friend was Herbert Spencer, I think, who used to come to her father's house. And I don't know if you know about Spencer. He was kind of a atheistic, I don't know, very sociological. His writings are kind of interesting, but they're dated. Social Darwinism, kind of. But anyway, this kind of thinking, they founded the London School of Economics. I don't know if you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And a bunch of educational institutions. I think they reorganized the University of London. I'm thinking it's very similar, like I said, to the League for Economic Democracy in the United States, because it had ambitions for education and for changing people's thought process. And that whole interwar period, where they had their first labor government to World War II, they got more and more of a taste of power. And so now you see them coming into power now. And of course, it was women's liberation, By the way, you mentioned, we talked about Wilson, Prime Minister Wilson, the Labor Party leader, who was suspected of being a Soviet agent. One of his big things in the 1960s and 70s was to remove the laws, the criminalizing of homosexuality. That was one of the things he was doing back when.
Yeah, they always looked for these causes, so they could say, "Oh, look what we're changing. It's progress. We're doing blah blah blah. We're saving everybody." Yeah. But eventually, they would run out of people to save, or people didn't want to be saved in that way. And as they needed to create misery, so there's more people that need saving, so to say. And here's also an interesting side note that ties into the United States today. So obviously, when you look into the British East India Company, you couldn't really tell, was it government, was it private, was it both? They really didn't care. They did what worked. But then listen to this. With this British East India Company, the administrators obviously were appointed by the Crown, like the Earl of Cornwallis. This is standard business. And then the new Indian civil service produced new cadres of administrators, such as the forebearers of Kamala Harris and possibly Joe Biden. I'm not joking. The forebearers, the ancestors of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. So
What ancestors?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. So this is
Yeah.
something that needs to be looked into a lot more. Some people started to do this more when Kamala became, vice president. So Joe Biden often refers to his Irish ancestors, but in a speech he gave in 2013, he claimed to have had ancestors in the British colony of India. And here's a specific name. Here's a professor, Professor Tim Willsey, visiting professor of war studies at King's College London, says it is likely that the president was related to Christopher Biden, who indeed worked for the East India Company. It says Christopher Biden lived and died in Madras, the very same place where Harris's mother was born. Harris's grandfather, said to be her inspiration, was an official for the British colonial empire in India. Yikes!
How bizarre! That's bizarre.
Yeah. So obviously the ties.
What a small world, huh?
Yeah. So the ties of Kamala Harris are more obvious and better documented. So when it comes to Biden, people really need to look into this more. Now we have a very astute professor who has looked into this, but that specific link needs to be investigated further.
So what is this? Is this a great grandfather of Biden?
Something like that. So we got some statements from Biden himself. We got a professor who's looked into this, and then of course we have Harris's grandfather, an official for the British colonial empire in India.
Maybe this is